Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about supplemental warps. The first part of this video is going to be discussing the planning, and then the second part of the video is going to be discussing how to actually warp your loom. And Layla's going to be my assistant today. So when I started this project, I had yarn that I already wanted to use. This is yarn I had custom milled for myself when I had my fiber company. And I knew I wanted it to be really fluffy for the pattern. So I actually ended up plying it back on itself. And the other yarn, I decided I wanted it to be like very thin. I wanted to be able to see the difference between the supplemental warp, which will be this thicker yarn, and then the background warp, which is this one. When you're planning your supplemental warp project, it's good to know if you are okay having all your threads be the same size, or if you want to have two separate weights. You'll need to treat them separately in the planning phase. My 10-2 cotton, for example, I only ended up warping it at 16 ends per inch, while this thicker yarn I ended up doing at 8 ends per inch. So as you can see, that would lead to some difficulties in the warping phase, which I will discuss later. So that's step one in determining what you want to do for your supplemental warp. Is, are you going to have all your threads, the pattern and the background, be the same weight, or would you rather have the pattern be a different weight from the background? So next up is your pattern choice. So two things to note first. You will need 2 more shafts than the pattern calls for when you're doing a supplemental warp. The other thing to note is if your pattern already has a tabby incorporated into it, you're basically halfway there in terms of designing the supplemental warp. So I picked out my pattern from Marguerite Davison's book, a hand weaver's pattern book. It's designed for 4 shaft looms. I have an 8 shaft loom, so I couldn't use any 8 shaft patterns because I would need 10 shafts. So I will show you what the pattern started out as. I chose a Swedish diamond number 1, and I decided I really like the diamonds, but I wanted to rotate them so they're going long ways on the loom. And so to flip the pattern, it's pretty simple, but it's a little confusing to think about. So I can show you here. So this is how the pattern was written, facing this way. My tabby's already incorporated into it. This would be my treadling with tabby in between each treadle. If you're using a computer program, there should be a button and it just says turn pattern, and it'll do it for you. If you're doing it by hand, all you need to do is rotate the pattern 90 degrees in a clockwise direction, and then take the treadling pattern with it. So the treadling pattern goes on top, and then you will rotate the threading pattern down, right? So now you have your pattern turned. So now my diamonds are going in the direction I would like them to go. So earlier I said if the pattern you choose has a tabby incorporated into it, you are halfway there. And that's because when you're doing a supplemental warp, you have your pattern sitting on top of the background threads, which will be woven in a plain weave. So if your pattern already has that incorporated into it, you really don't need to do anything else. However, if your pattern does not have a tabby, you're going to have to make sure to add that in. So for mine, the Swedish diamond, I don't need to do anything because this is already, so basically because I turned the draft, my tabby is up here in the top. And then The threading, which has become my treadling, already has the tabby incorporated into it. And so this is incorrect here, this part. Basically, it was a lot of work to add in the tabby in the computer every other. And so I did not do that. I just wrote the threading without the tabby. And we're going to discuss how to do the tabby in a second. So earlier I said, right, we have two different weights of yarn. So I have my bulky yarn and then I have my 10-2 yarn. And so this is where, for me, the supplemental warp gets the most complicated, because you have to think about how you're going to thread your heddles in a way to have these at 16 ends per inch and this at 8 ends per inch. So I have some samples, which I think are very important. So my first sample, you can sort of see the pattern. I did this one at 5 ends per inch for my bulky yarn here. And then I did the 16 ends per inch. This is actually a different cotton than I ended up using. I didn't like it, it's a little too yellow. But I ended up writing the draft out myself. I thought this would, and hopefully this is a little easier to show you. So here, I don't have any of the tabby, any of the background plain weave incorporated into it, into the threading. So here I have incorporated it. So this is our first V here. And then to get 5 ends per inch with 16 ends per inch in the tabby background threads, I would have to do 4 and then 1 and then 3 and then 1. And so when you're threading this, you'll have to make sure to leave these heddles available. And writing it out like this really helped me. And so, however, this one was a little too wide, you can't really see the pattern. So version 2, I did 16 ends per inch and then 8 ends per inch. And here again, you can see our first V. And so this one was much easier to thread because it would be 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So this is how 16 ends per inch versus 8 ends per inch for the pattern worked out. It's basically perfect. So I went ahead with this. So I ended up writing the entire pattern out here, and now we are done with the planning phase. In real life, this took me a couple months to complete. It was pretty frustrating, which is why I am sharing this as a more in-depth how-to than I normally do, because I absolutely love how this turned out. So next up, we are going to head to the loom and I will show you how to actually put this together. I started by warping my background threads. I'll be warping the loom using the front to back method, so just one cross is needed. I'm going to provide all my pattern details in a blog post, but I'll cover the general details here. This project is going to become 2 panels that will be sewn into a ripple fold curtain. I'm altering the Swedish diamond pattern, so there's a second supplemental warp pattern section on the cloth that will be separated by plain weave. This will allow me to cut the weaving, secure the edges, and have 2 panels with different patterns that were woven at the same time. I took Deb Essen's supplemental weaving class online, and she mentioned that the supplemental warp needed to be longer than the background threads. I ended up making the supplemental warp 12% longer plus an additional 14 inches because the warp needs to stay behind the back beam. First, we need to center the piece we're weaving and secure the background threads to the front beam with enough thread length to reach the heddles. Remember, the background threads are being warped front to back. This is the best way to warp my loom, but you may find back to front works better for you. We can take the cross we made and clip all the threads and the ends and place 2 threads per dent. I have an 8 dent reed and we're threading the background threads at 16 ends per inch, so this works out really well. You'll want to make sure your reed is big enough to fit the background threads and the supplemental warp through. Once that's done, we can move on to threading the heddles. For this project, I have 1 inch of plain weave on each edge of the cloth, so that's simple. My background heddles are on shafts 5 and 6, so I just threaded those every other. Once I got to the part of the cloth where the supplemental warp will go, I needed to make sure to skip a heddle between every 2 background thread heddles. This is specific to my pattern and ends per inch. You will have to test your yards if you're using different weights for the supplemental warp than what's being used for the background. If you're using the same weight for both, you will have 1 background heddle followed by 1 pattern heddle. It's important to be careful during this phase of warping, otherwise it's easy to twist your threads around the heddles. Once I finished the V-shaped section of the supplemental warp, I threaded heddles for more plain weave only, then moved on to threading the diagonal section. This is where we pause warping the background threads and move on to the supplemental warp. I do not have a second back beam and I do not have a loom that folds in the front. My loom does fold in the back, so I found it easiest to warp the supplemental threads using a hybrid method. Take the cross of the supplemental warp and thread the remaining heddles while sitting in the back of the loom. Pull the thread ends so they are facing the front beam. I pulled enough length through so I could tie the threads up after the heddles were threaded. I also piled the remaining warp on top of the shafts so they were out of the way. Now that all the heddles are threaded, I could fold my back beam out and finish warping the background threads. I use the lash cord method and I like to lift up a shaft just a few inches so I can see where the threads will separate in the pattern. I'm not a stickler for making sure my tension is perfect or making sure that I have the least amount of yarn waste possible. I deal with making sure the tension is perfect as I wind the warp. This is the first time I've used weights to keep the threads even. It was tedious, but so far my tension is even and consistent. Once the warp is wound on the back beam, tie the warp threads onto the front apron rod. I use the first half of a surgeon's knot as I'm balancing the tension, then I complete the knot when done. Now that the background warp is completely on the loom, I could finish warping the supplemental warp. This part is where I struggled the most with cross threads. The most important thing is to use the background threads to guide where the supplemental warp goes through the reed. Trace where the background thread to the right of your first supplemental warp goes through the reed, and that's where your first supplemental warp will go through the reed as well. Since my pattern ended up being 8 ends per inch on an 8 dent reed, I could go along and thread the rest of the warp without an issue. If that's not the case, you'll have to check your background warps as you go, because if your supplemental warp crosses them, you will not be able to weave. Since I don't have a second apron rod, I use 2 blocks of wood, clamps, and my rattle to create a back beam for my supplemental warp. I spread the warp so about 1 inch of threads sits through each section and is secured with a rubber band. The warp is being weighed down by 2 2-pound weights. Now you're ready to weave. This project has taken me so long to figure out. I haven't been able to find many resources on weaving a supplemental warp, so please comment if you have a book or teacher you love. I hope you enjoyed this video. Next up, I'm going to be sewing this into ripple fold curtains for my living room. If you're interested in seeing how that project goes, please subscribe and ring the bell to be notified when my next video is released.